Welcome to Prospective Doctors Mcat Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield Mcat topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Prospective Doctors Mcat Basics. Today I'm interviewing Kathryn. She is an Mcat tutor with Med School Coach. She also runs the Instagram page at the Pre-Med. It's very cool, very motivational. If you're not following her already, please go do that. She did really well on the Mcat, and she's here to talk to us today about the study habits she used, what she teaches her students. We're going to talk a little bit about gap years, and then we are going to do some Q&As from Kathryn's Instagram page. So Kathryn, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sam. It's a pleasure to be on today.
Of course. All right. So let's start with a little introduction about yourself. So, tell us where you went to school, what you're doing with your Instagram page, just some of that basic information.
Yeah, so I went to the University of Miami. I graduated in 2018, and there I studied biochemistry and neuroscience. So currently I am in a gap year, and I'm doing a lot of volunteering. I'm working as a tutor for Med School Coach. And I also have a lot of time for other things like my Instagram page. So I've really been trying to spread a lot of positivity and motivate other pre-meds.
Awesome. And before I want to move on to the Mcat stuff, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about Instagram in general. My Instagram game is pretty weak. I think I have like 3 or 4 posts on Instagram. So what's the secret? Give me the insider view here.
Okay, so inside scoop is it's all about the filters right now. So you have to have that Visco filter, that Lightroom filter, get a theme going. So it's all about the aesthetic right now. So all about the color scheme.
All right, I like it.
Yeah.
I'll have to work on that. All right, let's get into the Mcat a little bit here. So let's start with some advice for people who are just now starting to study or just thinking about studying. And I think a question that comes up a lot is, how long should I be studying for the Mcat? And so what do you usually tell people when they ask how long they should be studying?
Yeah, it is a tough question to answer. It depends on the student. So for students who have a strong basis in the sciences, so essentially any students who have above a 3.7 science GPA, you really don't need to study for as long as someone who's starting from a lower science GPA. With that being said, usually around 3 months is how long students like to spend studying for the Mcat. But I always recommend a longer amount of time, especially if you're in school, because that would be full time. So that's about how long I recommend, but it really depends on your overall knowledge that you're starting out with.
Yeah, definitely. No, I totally agree. And 3 months is kind of nice too, because a lot of people's summer break obviously falls within 3 months. And so it's kind of this natural time to study if you're going to study for the summer,
Yeah, exactly. The summer's a great time to study.
Yeah. So another question I get a lot is, what type of person should take a class versus self-study? Classes are expensive, but obviously you are investing in yourself for your future as a doctor. So what type of people should take a class? What type of people do you think can study on their own?
That's a great question. So again, it does go back to your strength in the sciences and whether or not you're a student who naturally studies well on their own, or if you're a student who often goes to office hours, has a tutor, gets more help. So for students who are really self-motivated, it's a great option to self-study. But even a self-motivated student, unless you know older pre-meds, you might not know where to start and what materials are the best. So in that case, a class would really be your best option because it tells you exactly what you should be doing at all times, and you don't have to do any guesswork. As far as students who should have a tutor, that really depends on if you have a lot of questions that you can't find answers to on the internet, or if you just like the more personalized approach, if you're starting from a really low science GPA, anything like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you there. Always good to have somebody, either a mentor or even somebody that you hire, just for a few hours to kind of help you either lay out a schedule or look over your schedule and say, okay, this is good. I did well this is something that looks good to me. So I agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. The schedule building, like you mentioned, that's really key. I think if you don't have a good schedule, you do waste a lot of your time studying, and time is very limited. So make sure you have a good schedule from the beginning.
So another thing too is, this is a mistake that I made, was I started studying and I did content review for, a few weeks before even taking a practice test. So what do you recommend in terms of when do you start tying in practice tests, and when do you switch over from content review to practice based questions, or do you switch over? Do you just do both at the same time right from the get-go?
It depends on the student, but what I usually recommend is that students take a test as soon as they start studying. So you have a baseline for where you are and where you need to improve the most. Then, depending on your goals and how much time you have, you should be focusing on content review primarily for a long time leading up till test day. But if you have extra time, you can always add in practice questions with that. And that's really for students who want to score highly. You should start practice questions right away. As far as the practice tests, those you can use sparingly up until basically the month before the exam. And then I recommend you take one every week the month before the exam. But my general advice would be not to overdo it with the practice test, because you do need time to improve in between them.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. And so when you took those practice tests, did you kind of try to take them, under testing conditions? And what did that look like when you did take those practice tests?
That's a great question. So students should really try to emulate testing conditions as much as they can. So what I did is I had a quiet room. I did use my laptop, but I had a mouse so I could pretend it was like a desktop computer. And I also used earplugs and took all of my breaks. So I made sure that it was exactly like test day, so there were no surprises, and my body was used to what I was going to put it through on the day of the test. So it felt very natural going into the testing center because I'd practiced it so many times.
Nice. Did you have like a set lunch? I know some people I've, talked to friends or whatever that say they ate the same exact thing for lunch every time they did it. Everything was down to a T. Was that you?
Definitely not with the lunches. My mom would pack my lunches for me because she's the real one. So I always had a variety.
Nice.
For test day, though, awesome. I think I didn't have anything that could upset my stomach. I made sure it was very bland just to avoid any surprises.
Gotcha. I like that.
Yeah.
So how many practice tests did you end up taking then? So one every weekend for a month. So was that like 5 or 6, or what are we talking?
So I believe that I took 5 practice tests that were non-AMC, and then I took all of the AMC tests. So that is pretty much like 9.5 exams. So that's what I took total. But mind you, I was studying from March until August. So I studied for a pretty long time compared to most students. So I did have more time to fit in those practice tests.
Gotcha. Cool. So let's move on now and talk a little bit about study habits. One thing that you have mentioned to me before and that I really like is this concept of not being an Mcat robot. So could you just talk about that? What's that mean? And just give us some examples of kind of what that means.
Yeah. So I love this mantra about not being an Mcat robot because it is so true. We're all students, but we're people before we're students. And people need time to relax and enjoy themselves outside of what can be a very stressful time. So our brains actually work a lot better when we're not stressed and when we have enough downtime between our studying. So you should find time to spend with your friends or exercise, do whatever it is that makes you outside of the test. I think it leads to better learning and better morale throughout testing, as well as avoiding that burnout that we all really fear.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what were your favorite things to do outside of the test?
Yeah, so I am very artsy. So I liked to write poems. I also was writing a poem Insta at the time. So I don't really keep active with that anymore, but it was a great outlet for me when I was studying for the MCAT. I would also go for runs on my lunch break to boost my productivity and just release all that energy that was building up in the library all day. And in addition to that, I would always try to find time to hang out with my friends if they were available on the weekends and things like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's one thing I always really like doing. And the one thing that I made sure to do every day when I was studying is find time to go exercise or go get outside, just get the blood pumping, get everything going that way. And then I could come back, be a little bit refreshed, come back to the test and keep going.
Yeah, and studies have shown that there are growth factors that are released when you exercise that are good for learning. So that's awesome that you did that.
Nice. So scientifically, I was helping myself as well.
Yes, scientifically, you were.
Good. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that I really focused on, and that was reviewing full-length tests. So how long did you spend kind of taking apart and reviewing your full-length tests after you took them?
I would spend at least 8 hours, if not 16 hours, reviewing a test. So it seems like a lot, but the test itself is almost 8 hours. So spending that amount of time to go into detail and review every single question and not just the questions that I got wrong, that was really key to getting a high score on the MCAT, is just making sure that there are no loose ends that I haven't addressed of things that I don't understand.
Yeah, that was huge for me too. So I would spend, I would take a practice test Saturday, and then I would spend Sunday just, going through all of it. And then I actually kept a spreadsheet of, I got this concept wrong, and then I could kind of filter that and sort through my spreadsheet and figure out certain concepts maybe I was missing, and that would help me focus my studies. So I think a huge part of studying for the MCAT is reviewing full-length tests that you've taken.
Yeah, exactly. So if any students out there aren't currently doing that, that is a huge tip, is to spend more time reviewing and pay more attention to reviewing than you do on the actual test, because that's what will improve your score, not picking the right answer on practice tests.
Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I wanted to talk to you about in terms of study habits are the Anki flashcards. And, I really liked them. They helped me memorize a lot of different things. They have this like special algorithm that kind of shows you like a certain number of flashcards a day. I just wanted to get your opinion on them. What do you kind of think about them?
Yeah, so Anki is something that I use myself, and I love using it for my science classes because it's a great way to memorize information. With that being said, though, the MCAT isn't really a memorization-based test, with a few exceptions, which I'll mention in a second. But a lot of the MCAT is testing your ability to apply knowledge. So they'll give you a passage, and you won't really have to have known a lot of memorized information, but you have to have those critical thinking skills to understand what's going on. So flashcards really can't help you build those critical thinking skills, but they do help in a few cases. So I really recommend Anki flashcards for the Psych-Soc section in particular, because it is so memorization based. But as far as the other sections, I think that building study sheets and more interactive study methods are better for the conceptual understanding. So that's how I feel about Anki in general for the MCAT.
What percentage of the questions on the MCAT are these non-passage based? I can't remember, like the standalone ones.
Yeah, so I don't exactly remember the number of like freestanding questions per section, but I do know it's largely passage-based, so you'll have 2 passages and then maybe 4 freestanding questions, and then it'll alternate like that. And even the freestanding questions, sometimes you'll have outside information that they're giving you. So even those you can't trust to be fully memorization-based.
Yeah, Yeah. So yeah, as you're studying, just keep that in mind. The MCAT is definitely not a memorization test. It's really this application test of how can you read this passage, pick up a few concepts from that passage and apply it to questions. So I think that's really important to remember as you study.
Yes, I totally agree.
All right, let's move on now to my favorite section on the MCAT, which is cars. It was by far my worst topic. So I don't really have much advice, particularly for this subject. However, what is your advice on cars? Do you have a method you use? How do you usually teach students to do well in cars?
Yeah, so cars is a big stumbling block for a lot of students. And that's because it is nothing like anything that most pre-meds have seen in any of their classes. And it's actually just testing your critical thinking skills. So it's something that you have to practice over a large amount of time to be able to improve. Because if we talk about the different types of memory, for example, there's explicit and implicit. So explicit would be like rote memorization, like Anki cards, but implicit's like riding a bike. So cars is more like riding a bike where you couldn't really say how to do it, but you can just do it. So I do have methods to get around this that I teach to students. So one of them is to pretend that you're talking to the author when you're reading their passage. So I like to imagine what they look like, how they speak, and really get into a visual sense of what's going on. So by incorporating other senses and using other parts of our brain, it can make these passages that seem boring a lot more interactive, and it helps us to critically think when we apply those visual senses to a passage.
So what do you think in terms of studying for cars? So how often do you recommend students do practice passages?
So I recommend that students practice at least one passage a day when they're fully studying for the Mcat. But if they're starting at a lower score, I usually recommend 2 a day. Beyond that, I think it gets a little bit excessive. So 2 passages should take you 40 minutes between actually doing the passages and reviewing them. So that's plenty for one day. And you can get a lot out of that if you choose to. So if you're putting in the time to really review and understand, why you got something wrong, where your critical thinking went wrong, that's how you're going to improve your score the most.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's great advice. So that is kind of how to study for cars. So what material did you use to study for cars? There's Jack Weston, there's the AAMC material, all the other third-party stuff. What did you find the most useful?
So the most useful is definitely the AAMC materials, but I save those for last. So if you're looking for something to do in the meantime before you start the AAMC, since there's really not a lot, there's only 240 cars questions that the AAMC gives us for QPACs. So what I did is I used the next step questions. But if I were to study again, I would actually use the Jack Weston passages because A, they're free. So if you haven't heard of Jack Weston, it's a website where he gives a passage of the day if you give him your email. And there's also an archive of all of the past ones. So I recommend just doing that because it's a free resource and also it mirrors the test pretty well in format and in style. So I really recommend Jack Weston for the practice leading up to AAMC.
Yeah, I like Jack Weston a lot too. So if you were to summarize your cars advice in a few words, would it be something like read a passage like you're actually talking to the person who wrote it, and then use Jack Weston? Is that about right?
Yeah, and actually one additional tip is for highlighting. This is something that students get wrong a lot, is they just don't understand how to highlight a passage, and it is pretty hard. So my advice for highlighting the passage is to wait and withhold highlighting until you read a paragraph, then highlight. So you can go back with a clearer head and understanding to capture the most important things.
Oh, I like that. So that kind of shows you, you figure out what the passage is going to be about, and then you can go in and start highlighting things that you can kind of start to feel are important.
Yeah, exactly. So I recommend that students go in and highlight for the main idea right after they read the paragraph, but not sooner. That way you actually can take in what the author's saying before you start highlighting it.
Gotcha. I like that. All right, let's transition now and talk a little bit about gap years. So this topic kind of came up with me and a few of my friends. We were talking about how a lot of pre-med students have this notion in their heads that, if I don't go straight into med school, I'm a failure, and it's going to be harder for me to get in, yada yada. And I really think this is a myth. What do you think about this, Kathryn? Do you think that is the case or not really?
So when you were talking about the students who think that they're a failure if they take a gap year, well, that was exactly how I felt about gap years before I became a gap year student. So for me, it did kind of feel like a personal failure where I always knew I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to go straight in. But I realized that it didn't really align with my goals for the type of applicant I wanted to be before I applied. And there are some important things that I actually wanted to get done in my gap year. So for me, although it was disappointing, it actually was a huge time for growth for me. So to address the people who feel like it's a failure, I would say, okay, but you can look at all the things that you can accomplish in a year and realize that not only will it make you more mature, it'll make you grow in ways that you didn't expect, and maybe you can get into a better medical school than you had planned. So I look at it as a positive now, even though I started with this negative view of gap years.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. I was a little different because I didn't really decide I wanted to go into medicine until probably my senior year of college. So I kind of had to take a little bit more time just to build my resume. But with that said, I think this gap year that I've had so far, at least, I've moved to a new city. I've, been on my own really kind of for the first time, living in a separate state, at least from my family. And so I think I've had a lot of personal growth, and, I'm really, really, really glad that I've done it.
Yeah, exactly. I think if you ask most gap year students, that's what they would say. So for all the students out there who are on the fence, it's definitely a good choice if you're looking to do something important with the year. It's a good option.
And so what are some of those things that you can do with a gap year? Is there any really kind of unique stories you've heard from people of things that they've done, or maybe what's something that you've done that you think is pretty unique?
Yeah, so the general advice I give is that if you have a low GPA, there are things that you can do in your gap year to correct that. So for students with a low science GPA, you can do a post-bac program. There are also Masters of Science programs where you're basically taking the same classes as first-year medical students. So those are extremely challenging, but you have a really low GPA and think that you can show admissions, you can handle medical school, that's also a good option. As far as what I didn't really have any concerns academically. I actually graduated early from college, so I was really looking for something to enhance my personal growth and fulfill some of my long-term goals. So I ended up doing a lot of volunteering. So I'm working in a hospital right now. I work as a crisis text counselor to assist people who are considering suicide. And I'm also starting a nonprofit. So I've been able to do all these things that I really just didn't have time to do in college. And it's been wonderful to be able to follow my heart, in a sense, in my gap year.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I think that's the number one thing that people can do on their gap year is do something that they love and do something that, is going to build towards a future career that they want to do. So that's awesome. That's awesome that you've been able to find that in your gap year.
Yeah, thank you.
And so one of the kind of concerns with taking a gap year or kind of this problem that people run into is, do I hurry and take the Mcat so that I can go into med school straight out of college, or do I take a gap year? And I think we kind of already answered this question a little bit, but what do you recommend for someone who's kind of teetering on the edge of either rushing and taking the MCAT or taking a gap year?
So it depends, again, going back to the dreaded science GPA, is whether or not you can handle a short MCAT schedule. So if that's you and you have a really high science GPA, like say 3.8 and above, then you can go ahead and give it your best shot for the MCAT. But for most students, I really think that taking the extra time to study and not be stressed for time with the MCAT is a great option, especially when you think about all the other things that you could do in a gap year besides the MCAT. It really becomes appealing because I've noticed that more and more. I saw on Instagram, one of my friends said that she went to some Ivy interviews and almost everyone except for her was a gap year student. So I think medical school admissions committees see it as a positive now for sure.
Yep. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And one thing I've noticed in terms of, writing secondary essays, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is a lot of schools will ask, what makes you a unique applicant, or what do you bring to our med school class? And so I think doing something unique in your gap year gives you something to write about, gives you something to talk about in interviews and stuff, just adds to your application.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I wrote about a whole lot that I did in college on my secondaries. I think I wrote more about my gap year because it's been a lot more interesting than studying for classes and a few leadership activities.
Yeah, and those the secondaries are kind of a monster, huh? It's a very big time consumer.
Yeah, I had no idea. 50 pages in and maybe halfway done.
Fun stuff.
Oh yeah. How are you doing with them?
It's going. I'm trying to kind of pre-write them right now and, do it ahead of time, but it's hard. It's hard. So, I'm busy with work, whatever, but yeah, I'm getting them done.
Okay, good. Glad to hear it.
All right, let's switch now and start talking about some of the Q&As from your Instagram. So you can go ahead, start wherever you want, and we'll start answering these.
Yeah, so thank you to everyone who actually asked questions on my Instagram. So now we'll get a chance to answer them. So the first one we'll get started with is it recommended that I take a gap year after college, then apply to medical school?
So we talked about this a little bit, but in my opinion, it depends on your situation. So if you're someone who's known that you've always wanted to go into medicine and you're already a strong applicant, you've got this good GPA, you've got good experiences, then you do it. Go straight in and take the MCAT, do well on that, go straight in. But if you are teetering on the edge, or you're saying, my GPA is a little low, or maybe my MCAT's a little low, and you feel like you need to do something to improve your resume or give you a little unique experience or whatever, then I totally recommend taking a gap year.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you said, Sam. It's really all about if you feel like there's a place that you want to improve and it's nagging on you, just go ahead and do it because the year really does fly by. And it also gives you a lot more time to work on your application, which I honestly could not imagine filling out while I was taking classes.
No, not at all.
Kudos to everyone who actually does that.
Yeah, that's tough.
So we have another question here. When should I start prepping for the MCAT?
So you said about 3 months, and I agree there. I think 3 months is plenty of time. However, if you are working while you're doing it, or maybe you're taking classes and you can only study part-time, then it's going to take more time. So, maybe 3 to 6 months, depending on where you're at. I always recommend taking a practice test before, you even start studying, something that I wish I would have done. And that'll kind of set you up, help you figure out how much study time you're going to need.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer. Especially with taking the practice exam to start out, that'll give you a lot of information about how many points you need to improve. And then you can plan out how much time that'll take. So if it's just a few points, then the 3-month study schedule should be good for you. But if you're someone who's really aiming for the stars, you can spread it out over a longer amount of time to get more gains in your score, which I highly recommend if you're trying to apply to a competitive school, is to study for maybe even 6 months if you're worried about that aspect of your application.
Yeah. Because I mean, what are the two biggest determinants of getting into medical school, in your opinion?
I'd say GPA and Mcat because, I mean, unfortunately, that's the reality. But extracurriculars do play a role. Like if you're someone who has perfect stats but no leadership, that might be a red flag for an admissions committee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I just think it's something to keep in your mind is, if you have to take extra time to study for the MCAT, do it, because if you get a terrible score on the MCAT, odds are not good for getting into medical school.
Yeah. What's the advice I read the other day? It was like, the MCAT won't get you into a school, but it'll prevent you from getting into a school.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind is it can open the doors, but it won't get you in.
Yep. No, I totally agree. Can I ask you a question from for the Instagram? Can I be a Q&A?
Oh yeah, you can be a part of the Q&A.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Here's my question. So how do you feel about setting the test date ahead of time? Because, I had a friend who was studying for, 3 months for the MCAT, never set his date, just kept studying, and was like, yeah, kind of half-assed. Yeah, I'm going to take it. I think I'm going to take it. Maybe I'm not. And it's been a year since he started studying. He still hasn't taken it. So what do you recommend in terms of like setting your test date? When should you do that?
Oh, okay. So 100% you should set a test date. And I recommend that you set the test date as soon as you start studying, if not in advance of when you start studying. Because we talked about at the beginning the importance of having a plan. And accountability for the plan is something that is incredibly important. So if you don't have a test date, you don't have to be accountable for anything. So chances are you're going to end up studying for a longer and longer period of time because you're not holding yourself to any sort of deadline. So it's incredibly important that you set that date and you set it towards the beginning of your studies.
Yep, I agree 100%. I think I set mine, a few weeks after I studied, or a few weeks after I started studying, and that kind of really just focused me in and was like, man, I gotta get this done. I gotta really put in time so that I'm ready for that test date.
Yeah, it provides that scare factor.
Yes,
unfortunately, but we need it.
Which is good. Yeah, no, it's a kick in the ass, and you're like, okay, I need to get going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you for letting me be a Q&A.
You're welcome. All right. So the next question, students asked, when do you apply for med school during your gap year?
So I'm going to take 2 gap years, which means I graduated approximately a year from now, or I graduated a year ago from now. And so I'm applying to med school a year after I graduate, which is a year into my 2 gap years. So if I get into school, I'll essentially take 1 more year in between when I get accepted and when I start school, or about 6 months.
Yeah, and that's great for students who are taking 2 years off. And I think 2 years is a really good amount of time because I was interested in doing a lot of different service programs, but most of them were 2 years. And unfortunately, I wasn't thinking ahead, so I only was going to do 1 year. So my options were kind of limited in terms of what I could do with a 1 year gap year.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of different programs that you can do for 2 years. Go do something different. There's Peace Corps. What's the scholarship program where you can go teach overseas?
Fulbright.
Yeah, Fulbright. Yeah. You can go do a Fulbright. There's all these different programs. So, I think you can kind of just keep an open mind towards that stuff.
Yeah. So those are all really great. So I wish I had considered taking 2 years off, but for students who are just taking 1 year off, you should apply to medical school at the end of your senior year. So that way the whole application cycle is during your gap year. So that's kind of the path I'm on, except I graduated a semester early. So I've had this whole extra 6 months off to prepare my application, which has been really nice. All right, so I think we'll move on to the next question. So this student asked, I have all the books for the MCAT, but every time I look at them, I get overwhelmed. How do I start?
Well, I definitely feel this person, but basically my advice is this. If every time you look at them, you get overwhelmed, sit down and make a plan. Plan out what days you're going to study for a month or 2 months or 3 months. Just set it all out. And that way you can kind of see exactly how you're going to tackle the MCAT. And then you can start every day by saying, okay, I know what I'm going to do. And you're going to do that. And you're just going to take it day by day until you study for the MCAT. And the test time comes and you go get through all the books and you do well on the MCAT.
Yeah, that's exactly what you should do. The hardest part is maintaining focus through that. So if you're getting overwhelmed just staring at the books, consider first, okay, what are your thoughts that you're having? And another thing that I recommend is putting away the smartphone when you're studying, because oftentimes that can be our worst enemy towards a productive day, is going through Instagram or whatever it might be on your phone. So finding a place to focus that's quiet and conducive to studying is also important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that was a question I had for you is, since you run at least one Instagram page, I'm sure, I think you're saying you have more than that, but how big of a challenge was that for you when you were studying?
It was challenging. I definitely took some study breaks to focus on the social media aspect, but I made sure that it was time that I had scheduled in. So I was very careful not to let it bleed into my study time. So one technique that I really like is called the Pomodoro Method. So you basically study for 25 minutes and then get a 5-minute break. That's really helpful because our brains aren't designed to maintain pure focus for 8 hours. So if you can break up the day and break up the studying into smaller chunks, that tends to really help. So I had scheduled time for everything because it made me accountable for not going over and sitting in the library all day getting nothing done.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's great. That's awesome advice.
Yeah, thanks. So, all right, next question is, how long should I study part or full time? So I guess this is the difference between part-time and full-time studying.
Yeah, what I recommend is 3 months full-time, 6 months part-time. But again, you have to give a little bit of time on either end, depending on how prepared you are in terms of classes for the MCAT. So, I really like the idea of the science GPA. Go off of that and kind of start to gauge how much time it's going to take you. Again, take a full length right at the beginning, and that way you can kind of gauge. But yeah, so in general, I would recommend 3 months full-time, 6 months part-time.
Yeah, that's exactly what I recommend too. One thing I can add is that if you're aiming for really high score, like 98th, 99th percentile, try to push it out longer than 3 months, because very few people can get that kind of a score in just 3 months. So if you have one of those really high goals, which is totally not necessary to get into medical school, but if you do have a goal like that, give yourself maybe even double the time, because it takes a lot of effort to get there. So how to not get overwhelmed by the MCAT? That is our next question.
Well, in my opinion, it is impossible not to get overwhelmed, because the MCAT just covers so much. You've got biology, chemistry, physics, psych, soc, cars. It's just, it makes your head spin. But like I said earlier, I think planning your study schedule and seeing it all on paper and how you're just going to tackle it every day, kind of helps make that less overwhelming. So that's kind of my advice. And you got to live life outside of the MCAT. So make sure you're hanging out with friends, go and see movies, whatever you enjoy doing, keep doing that.
Yeah, I actually want to ask you a follow-up question to this one. So what did you personally do to avoid burnout during your studies?
So for me, a lot of it was working out. So I'd try to work out in the middle of the day, hang out with friends at night. But one big thing for me was I would always try to plan something at night. So, I'd always, text my friends or whatever and say, hey, let's go do this tonight. That way I had something to kind of look forward to and kind of, I guess, motivated me a little bit to study.
Yeah, that's great. what I did is I made sure to take the weekends off. So I would always look forward to the weekend and the things I had planned. And I knew that I had to get everything done in order to really enjoy the weekend. So that's what kept me from burning out.
Gotcha.
Awesome. All right. So this student wrote advice for the final week before the Mcat. And this is apparently when the podcast will be out for the student. So what are your tips?
So I have a few tips. The first is that you should give your brain a break for maybe a day or so before the Mcat. So for me, I studied just some really content-based stuff. So I did some flashcards all the way up to, 2 days before the test. And then those last 2 days before the test, I just took completely off and tried to give my brain a break. And then one thing that was really big for me was the night before the test, I knew I was going to be really anxious and it was going to be hard for me to sleep. So what I did is I did, a super, super hard workout. In that way, I ensured that I was going to be really, really tired and I was able to sleep really well and fall asleep right away just because I was so tired. So something maybe you could do, but I really thought that was helpful.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly my advice too. The day before the Mcat, I got a massage, I got my nails done. So it was definitely a time to relax and just reward myself for all the hard work before the test.
And one other thing too that I'll add is, this is something that I don't think a lot of people think about, but one thing I did is in the weeks leading up to the test, I tried not to drink any alcohol. And I don't want to sound like I'm your mom or something, but I try not to drink any alcohol because I know that tends to impair memory. And so leading up, I just tried basically not to drink any alcohol.
Yeah, that's great advice too. And I've never thought to tell students that, but it is so important. I don't think we realize how much of an effect it has on us even days after. So being sure to make your Mcat time a little less than your usual would be good, especially leading up to the exam.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so the next question we have from a student is, how bad is it to retake the Mcat? I've heard it doesn't look good.
My understanding is that it's not that big of a deal unless you retake and you get a very similar score to what you got before. If you retake the Mcat and you get a little bit higher, it's not that big of a deal. I think schools will either average the two scores together and take the average, or some schools take the higher of the two. So it just varies by school. But I think the big no-no is to not get the same score as you got the first time if you retake.
I completely agree. You do have to improve a lot for your second time. And it's actually recommended that you don't take it more than 3 times. So be sure to limit as much as possible the number of retakes and improve each time. So the next question is asking, so when did you start studying for the Mcat? And what was the breakdown of your studying each day and week?
So I started about 2 weeks after graduation. So that would be the end of May in 2018. And I studied until August. So I took it in August 18th, 2018. So after those first 2 weeks of graduation, I started content review. And I think I did content review for 2 or 3 weeks. And then after that, I started tying in practice material. And then about a month out from the test, I did a practice test every single Saturday, simulated test conditions. And then in that way, when I took the test, I was like, oh, this is a piece of cake. I've done this every single weekend leading up to it.
Yeah, that's a great study schedule. And it mirrors what I recommend to my students, also mirrors what I did. So I started studying on spring break of 2018. And then I actually took it on the same day as you, so August 18th.
Nice.
Clearly
so
a lot of...
You set this, you're the one who set the curve really high. It's messed up.
Oh, man.
The rest of us look bad.
I've heard that before, too. It's funny. As far as what I did for content is I read all the books. So I did the Next Step online self-paced course. So for me, I didn't have a lot of older friends to tell me what to study. So this gave me a blueprint of what to study each day, and I just followed it. So it had me doing a lot of reading, like 2 chapters a day, and then a block of questions. So I did that until July. And then I started with all the AMC stuff every day. So I would do AMC practice for like 8 hours a day in the summer. And then that's what I did leading up until test day.
Gotcha.
Just like you, I took the exams under testing conditions, and I took about one a week for the last month. So
cool.
That's what I did.
Cool.
Okay, so the next question just says content review versus practice. So I'm guessing the student wants us to weigh the merits of both of these things.
Or they are on Jeopardy and they're asking us in question, in statement form. And we should have to answer in question form, right?
Yeah, the student is asking a lot of us.
I couldn't do that.
Me neither.
So my advice is, and this is kind of retrospective because I didn't do this, but I wish I would have, is start practicing material as soon as possible. And that way you'll be able to start learning how to apply concepts and understanding how the MCAT wants you to think and starting to get a feel for these passage-based questions.
Yeah, I totally agree. The MCAT is such a different beast from your classes that you really have to understand the way they'll be asking you things, because you could spend your whole time reading the books and see a question and not even understand what content they're asking you about. So it's important to meld the two together.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next one's kind of a personal question, but seems like a cool one. So what do you do for work?
So for work, right now I work at the National Institutes of Health, which is just right outside of DC. I'm working on an HIV project. So it kind of combines engineering, which is what my degree was in, with a little bit of biology. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to separate these single cells that are HIV positive. So it's called the Latent Reservoir. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but we're trying to separate these single cells and then be able to actually study these single cells. So right now it's just a lot of trying to figure out how that process works, but it's a pretty interesting project.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love HIV research. I was doing prevention research in college. So
awesome.
Yeah, you're doing great work. It's great. As far as what I'm doing, I'm working as an Mcat tutor. So that's my job that I get paid for. Outside of that, I'm working on a nonprofit to help the LGBTQ community access healthcare in my area. So it's kind of what I've been up to outside of volunteering at the hospital and everything.
Very cool. Very cool. And would you want to talk at all about what exactly your nonprofit does?
Oh, yeah. So I'm actually just starting it this year. So it's really new. What I'm doing is doing a lot of research into how LGBTQ people are treated differently at their doctor's office and what we can do to fix that. So I'm putting together educational materials for physicians in my area to become certified in treating these communities, and then putting together a database that the public can access to find a gay affirmative provider. So I'm really excited about what's to come this year with the nonprofit.
That's awesome. That's very cool.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so we can move on to our next question, which is, what are the best things to do in the gap year to fix low GPA or things that make you stand out?
Well, in my opinion, one thing to do is do a post-bac. So you could go take these post-bac courses, which essentially would then boost up your GPA, if of course you did well in these classes. Another piece of advice I have is do something that makes you unique or makes you stand out. We kind of talked about that earlier. This is something you could do with a gap year. And my last piece of advice is that if you have a low GPA, the best thing you can do is to just kill the MCAT. I think you can kind of balance out. I would hate to say balance out, but you can boost up your resume a little bit, at least, by killing the MCAT if you have that low GPA.
Yeah, that's perfect advice. I don't really have anything to add to that because that's exactly what you should do if you have a lower GPA in your gap year. Next question is, how long did you spend studying for the MCAT?
So I spent 3 months, studied from end of May to beginning of August, or I guess mid-August.
Great. And I studied for about 6 months, I believe. I just counted on my fingers, so could be wrong there. But I studied from March until August. Yeah, plus or minus fingers for our differential there. All right. So hope that answers that question for the student there. Next question is, how do you explain to your significant other that gap years are normal and it doesn't mean you're dumb?
Well, I think what you got to do is you got to give them the data. So the data says that on average, medical school students take like 1 or 2 gap years. So first of all, it's the norm. And second of all, having this experience that, makes you grow as a person or sets you on a career path is just so important. And so it can be so impactful to your career as a doctor that I think in a way it's invaluable. So, you can just, if I was you, I would show them the data and say, hey, look, I'm normal. I'm not dumb.
Yeah, exactly. And also just to add some sass in there, like we're both gap year students. I don't think either of us are dumb. So you can use the anecdotal evidence as well. You
can give them our phone numbers. Have them call us. We'll set the record straight.
Yeah. Hopefully they don't actually say you're dumb though. That makes me sad.
Yeah, that would be not good.
All right. So last question actually. So any advice for someone stuck at the same score on practice exams and feeling helpless?
My advice here is that if you are feeling stuck and you're feeling like you're not going anywhere, then I think something is wrong with the way that you're studying. So, take kind of an introspective look and say, what am I doing wrong in studying? What are some ways I can switch up? Maybe change the way you review your practice tests or change the way you go through practice material. One thing I really liked is making an Excel spreadsheet of questions I missed on a practice exam and the reason why I missed it. And then at the end of the day, I could look through and look for trends and see if that would help me study in some particular way.
Yeah, using a spreadsheet is such a great tip. I tell all my students to utilize a spreadsheet or a Word document or some way to track what they're getting wrong and see patterns. And additionally, if you have someone who's already taken the Mcat, they can be a really big asset to you at this time because they can probably help you see what you're doing wrong if you're not improving. So have someone that you trust, like a mentor, someone who's in medical school or maybe a year older than you, or even a tutor can help you with things like that. So find someone. I know, really, #ad.
No, I'm kidding.
Also,
no, it's great
students
advice.
Can rely on their friends a lot too for help. So if you can't afford a tutor, there are ways that you can get help as well.
No, yeah, I totally agree with you on the tutoring. I think if you are kind of stuck and you're getting the same scores over and over and over on a practice test, think about the kind of investment it's going to be. This is going to get you into medical school, into your dream career. How much is that worth to you? Is that worth $500, however much it costs to get a tutor? And, it might even be a single tutor session that will help you, maybe set a new study schedule, or maybe your tutor will be able to look over your study schedule and be like, hey, this is exactly what's not working. And so it will help you get another set of eyes on your study schedule or the way that you're studying and kind of help you set the record straight.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the biggest part of my job is honestly troubleshooting with students rather than just teaching things. It's more me trying to figure out what's going wrong and helping them to have it go right next time. So.
Yep, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Kathryn. Well, I really appreciate your time on Prospective Doctors Mcat Basics. I really appreciate it. Thank you for talking to me today.
Yeah, you're so welcome. It was a pleasure to be talking with you, and I hope that this was helpful for anyone listening. So, thanks again, Sam.
Yeah, and good luck on all your secondaries and with your interviews and everything.
Yeah, good luck to you as well. Can't wait to see where you end up.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctors Mcat Podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out prospectivedoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the Mcat or get